22nd, 1941, everything changed forever. Two men who had considered each other mortal enemies for a quarter of a century suddenly found themselves on the same side of the barricades. Aristocrat Winston Churchill and revolutionary Joseph Stalin, their alliance seemed unthinkable, but it was precisely this alliance that decided the outcome of the most terrible war in human history. How did an imperialist and a communist learn to trust each other? Why did their alliance fall apart immediately after victory? And what lessons does this alliance teach us today? Today, we will reveal the secrets of the most paradoxical partnership of the 20th century. What do you think? Could the alliance between Stalin and Churchill have survived if Roosevelt had lived longer? Or was the Cold War inevitable regardless of the personalities of the leaders? Share your opinion in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We have many more amazing stories ahead of us about how the personal relationships of politicians changed the fate of entire nations. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill and Joseph Vissarionovich Djougashvili are two names that forever changed the course of world history. One was a hereditary aristocrat, educated at Eton and Sandhurst, and the son of the Duke of Marlborough. The other was the son of a shoemaker from Gori, a seminarian who became a revolutionary. What could a British imperialist and a Soviet communist possibly have in common? From the very first days of the October Revolution of 1917, Churchill became an implacable enemy of Bolshevik Russia. "Suffocate Bolshevism in its cradle." These words became his political credo. As Minister of War in Lloyd George's government, he actively lobbied for the Entente's intervention in the Civil War, demanding that British troops be sent to support the White Movement. Stalin remembered these actions well. In his eyes, Churchill was the embodiment of everything the Soviet Union fought against: imperialism, capitalism, class oppression. The British Prime Minister, in turn, saw the Soviet leader as the embodiment of the Red Menace that was undermining the foundations of the civilized world. For 24 years, they regarded each other as mortal enemies. Churchill called for the creation of a sanitary cordon around the USSR, supported anti-Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe, and denounced the tyranny of the Kremlin. Stalin responded with exposés of imperialist intrigues and bourgeois aggression. But history had an incredible twist in store for them. A third force, more terrifying than their mutual enmity, would force these irreconcilable adversaries to reach out to each other. Adolf Hitler's National Socialism would become the catalyst that turned sworn enemies into allies of necessity. By the mid-1930s, a perceptive British politician began to understand that the threat of Nazism exceeded the danger of communism. Hitler's Germany had the potential to destroy the entire world order, including the British Empire. And although London's official policy would continue to be based on appeasing the aggressor for a long time to come, Churchill was already beginning to explore the possibilities of rapprochement with Moscow. This story did not begin on June 22, 1941, but much earlier, at the moment when the two greatest politicians of the 20th century realized that sometimes you have to make a deal with the devil to defeat an even greater evil. By the mid-1930s, the political map of Europe was changing rapidly. Germany was turning into a militaristic state, Italy was dreaming of a new Roman Empire, and Japan was expanding its holdings in the Far East. In this new reality, old enemies were forced to rethink their positions. Churchill, who was then in political disgrace, was one of the first to realize the scale of the impending catastrophe. In his articles and speeches, he tirelessly warned of the growing power of the Third Reich. "Germany is arming itself with feverish speed," he wrote in 1934. "Every 6 months, the number of trained military pilots doubles." Moscow was also watching events closely. Stalin understood that sooner or later, Nazi Germany would turn its attention to the east. The doctrine of living space directly threatened the existence of the Soviet Union. That is why Soviet diplomacy began to actively explore the possibilities of creating a collective security system in Europe. The People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs, headed by Maxim Litvinov, put forward the concept of the indivisibility of the world. Its essence was to create a broad coalition of democratic states to deter aggressors. Moscow was ready to forget past grievances and unite even with imperialist powers against the common fascist threat. The year 1938 was a turning point. The Munich Agreement showed the Soviet leadership the true face of Western diplomacy. Chamberlain and Daladier betrayed Czechoslovakia by handing over the Sudetenland to Hitler without even inviting Soviet representatives to the negotiations. For Stalin, this was the final proof that the West was ready to direct Nazi aggression eastward. Churchill was one of the few British politicians who condemned the Munich Agreement. "We have suffered a complete and unjustifiable defeat," he declared in the House of Commons. But his voice was lost in the chorus of appeasers. Official Britain still hoped that Hitler could be directed against the USSR, avoiding a direct confrontation. In the spring of 1939, negotiations began between England, France, and the Soviet Union on the creation of an anti-German bloc. Stalin demanded guarantees of the inviolability of all Eastern European states, including the Baltic states. The Western powers hesitated, unwilling to grant the USSR such broad rights. The negotiations reached an impasse, and then the Soviet leader made a decision that shook the whole world. On August 23, 1939, a non-aggression pact was signed in Moscow between the USSR and Germany. Molotov and Ribbentrop signed a document that radically changed the balance of power in Europe. Churchill's reaction to this treaty was contradictory but telling. In favor of the Soviets, it must be said that it was vitally important for the Soviet Union to push the starting positions of the German armies as far west as possible. Sunday, June 22, 1941, 4 a.m. Moscow time. Artillery fire on the border from the Baltic to the Black Sea heralded the beginning of the bloodiest war in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun. At that moment, the balance of power in the world political arena changed dramatically. Yesterday's enemies became potential allies, and recent partners turned into mortal enemies. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact ceased to exist with the first volleys of German artillery. The news of Germany's attack on the USSR reached Churchill at Chequers, his country residence. According to the memoirs of his secretary John Colville, the Prime Minister was walking in the garden with his private secretary, Jacques Coqueville. Upon hearing the news, Churchill stopped and uttered a phrase that has become historic. "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable mention of Satan in the House of Commons." But behind this seemingly cynical phrase lay a deep understanding of the new geopolitical reality. Churchill instantly realized that an attack on the USSR meant that Germany would be drawn into a war on two fronts. It was a mistake that had already cost the Germans defeat in World War I. That same evening, the Prime Minister addressed the nation on the radio. The speech lasted 12 minutes, and became one of the most significant in his political career. "I have been a consistent opponent of communism for the last 25 years, he began. "I will not renounce a single word I have said. But all that is meaningless in the light of what is happening today." These words required a tremendous moral effort on the part of the British leader. A man who had fought against Bolshevism for a quarter of a century publicly declared his readiness to ally with the communist regime. "The danger to Russia is our danger, and the danger to the United States," he continued. "We will give Russia and the Russian people all the help we can." In Moscow, Churchill's speech was listened to with great attention. Stalin, despite all the previous disagreements, understood the value of British support. The USSR found itself in a desperate situation. German tank wedges were cutting through Soviet defenses. Millions of Red Army soldiers were surrounded, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. But the Soviet leader was in no hurry to respond. His silence in the early days of the war became the subject of much speculation. It was only on July 3rd, 11 days after the start of the aggression, that Stalin addressed the nation in a radio speech. "The enemy is cruel and relentless," he said. "Its goal is to seize our lands, watered with our sweat, to seize our bread and our oil, produced by our labor." There was no mention of Churchill or Britain in this address. Stalin was not yet ready to publicly acknowledge the need for an alliance with yesterday's enemies. The gulf of mutual distrust was too great, and the memories of 24 years of ideological confrontation were too fresh. But behind the scenes, the diplomatic machine had already begun to work. On June 24th, the Soviet ambassador to London, Ivan Maysky, met with Foreign Minister Anthony Eden. Consultations began on possible forms of cooperation. The war forced them to forget past grievances and seek common ground in the face of a mortal threat. Churchill's first personal letter to Stalin was sent on July 7, 1941. This message marked the beginning of one of the most unusual exchanges in the history of diplomacy, between an aristocrat and a revolutionary, between the defender of an empire and the builder of communism. "We will do everything we can to help you, as far as time, geography, and our resources allow," wrote the British Prime Minister. Behind these restrained diplomatic formulations lay a revolutionary change in British policy. A country that until recently had viewed the USSR as the main threat to civilization was now offering it military assistance. The letter was delivered via the Soviet ambassador in London, Maysky, who from the first days of the war had become a key figure in establishing British-Soviet relations. The experienced diplomat understood perfectly well the historical significance of the moment and made every effort to overcome mutual distrust. Stalin replied to Churchill's letter a week later, on July 15th. The tone of his message was emphatically businesslike, without the slightest hint of emotion or personal sympathy. "The Soviet government welcomes the willingness of His Majesty's government to assist the Soviet Union in the war against Hitler's Germany," the reply began. But behind this official wording lay an important signal. The USSR was ready to cooperate. Stalin proposed specific areas of cooperation: the creation of a front in Western Europe that would divert German forces from the Eastern theater of war, and an increase in the supply of military materials to the Soviet Union. From the very beginning, the question of a second front became a stumbling block in relations between the Allies. Churchill understood perfectly well that Britain was not yet ready for a large-scale amphibious operation in Europe. German aviation still posed a serious threat to the British Isles, and the kingdom's land forces were extremely limited. Instead of a second front, London could offer something else: material assistance. By the end of July, the first British shipments had already left for the USSR via the Northern Sea route. The ships sailed through the Arctic to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, overcoming not only harsh natural conditions, but also attacks by German submarines and aircraft. The visit of a representative of the British government to Moscow had symbolic significance. At the end of July, a delegation led by Harry Hopkins, the closest advisor to U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, arrived in the Soviet capital. Formally, he represented the United States, but in fact, he acted on behalf of the Anglo-American alliance. Hopkins spent several days in Moscow, meeting with Stalin and studying the state of the Soviet armed forces. His impressions were mixed. On the one hand, the scale of the German offensive was staggering. On the other hand, the Soviet leadership demonstrated its determination to continue the fight at any cost. "I am convinced that the Russians will fight to the end," Hopkins telegraphed to Washington. This message was of great importance for the formation of American and British policy. If the USSR was indeed capable of offering long-term resistance to the Wehrmacht, then helping it would be not only morally justified, but also strategically expedient. The first weeks of correspondence between Churchill and Stalin laid the foundation for a future alliance. Both leaders understood that their personal relationship would largely determine the nature of cooperation between the two great powers in the fight against their common enemy. By the fall of 1941, it had become clear that the fate of the anti-Hitler coalition depended largely on the ability of the Western Allies to supply the Soviet Union with military materials. The Red Army was suffering enormous losses in manpower and equipment. Soviet industry had been evacuated to the east, and German troops were approaching Moscow. On October 1st, Stalin sent Churchill a telegram that became one of the most dramatic documents of the war. "The situation of the Soviet Union in connection with the loss of Ukraine has become noticeably worse," wrote the Soviet leader. "We have lost more than half of our coal and metal, as well as a significant part of our other production capacity." Behind the dry figures lay a tragedy of enormous proportions. The USSR had lost its most important industrial regions. Millions of Soviet citizens were under occupation, and hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers had been killed or taken prisoner. In these circumstances, external aid became a matter of life and death. Churchill understood perfectly well the critical situation of his ally. "We are prepared to sacrifice much to help you," he replied to Stalin. But the British economy itself was experiencing enormous difficulties. The Battle of the Atlantic was in full swing, with German submarines sinking British merchant ships faster than they could be built. Salvation came from across the ocean. On March 11, 1941, the U.S. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the U.S. to supply military materials to countries fighting against fascism. Initially, this program was intended for Great Britain, but after Germany's attack on the USSR, it was extended to the Soviet Union. On October 1st, a trilateral conference of representatives of the USSR, Great Britain, and the United States on military supplies began in Moscow. The Soviet delegation was headed by People's Commissar for Foreign Trade Anastas Mikoyan, the British delegation by Lord Beaverbrook, and the American delegation by Averell Harriman. The negotiations took place in an extremely tense atmosphere. Outside the windows of the Metropole Hotel, where the foreign delegations were staying, the explosions of anti-aircraft shells could be heard as German aircraft carried out raids on the Soviet capital. The conference participants literally agreed to help the besieged city. The Soviet requests were staggering in scale. The Red Army needed 400 tanks per month, 500 fighter planes, thousands of anti-tank guns, and hundreds of thousands of rifles. In addition, the USSR needed aluminum for the aviation industry, high-quality steel, and modern equipment for military factories. Beaverbrook, a media mogul and close friend of Churchill, showed remarkable generosity in these negotiations. "We will give everything we can, and even more," he said at one of the meetings. The British delegation agreed to transfer to the USSR a significant portion of the tanks and aircraft intended for its own armed forces. The Americans were more cautious, but their contribution was also decisive. Harriman managed to obtain Washington's agreement to supply strategic materials that were particularly needed by the Soviet military industry. The total value of the aid promised at the conference exceeded $1 billion, a colossal sum at the time. But the main result of the Moscow talks was not the signing of formal agreements, but the establishment of personal trust between the representatives of the three countries. Western diplomats saw with their own eyes the determination of the Soviet leadership to continue the struggle, and the Soviet side received concrete evidence of the Allies' readiness to provide real assistance. The first convoys with Lend-Lease cargoes set off for the USSR in November 1941. The route lay through the icy waters of the Arctic, where German submarines and aircraft based in occupied Norway awaited them. The winter of 1941 to 1942 became a turning point, not only on the battlefronts, but also in relations between the future Allies. The failure of the German offensive on Moscow and the successful Soviet counteroffensive radically changed the West's perception of the USSR. Back in August, many Western military experts predicted the rapid fall of the Soviet Union. German troops were standing outside Leningrad, approaching Moscow, and had captured Kiev. It seemed that the colossal military machine of the Wehrmacht would sweep away Soviet resistance in a matter of months. But the Red Army's winter offensive disproved all the pessimistic predictions. On December 6th, a counteroffensive began near Moscow, which pushed German troops back 100 to 200 kilometers from the Soviet capital. The myth of the invincibility of the German army was dispelled. Churchill closely followed developments on the Eastern Front. The successes of the Red Army not only inspired him as an ally, but also forced him to reconsider his long-term strategy. If the USSR could hold out and go on the offensive, the balance of power in the world would change dramatically. On December 7th, an event took place that finally cemented the anti-Hitler coalition. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into the World War. Now, three great powers, the USSR, Great Britain, and the United States, were fighting against the bloc of fascist states. Churchill immediately understood the significance of this turn of events. That same evening, he called Roosevelt. "Mr. President, we are now in the same boat." Indeed, America's entry into the war radically improved the Allies' prospects. The colossal industrial potential of the United States was now fully focused on defeating fascism. On December 22nd, Churchill arrived in Washington for the first military conference with the American leadership. During the negotiations, the Germany First strategy was confirmed. The Allies' main efforts were to be concentrated on the European theater of war. But this decision automatically increased the importance of the Soviet front. It was there that the main forces of the German army were being crushed, and it was there that the fate of the war was being decided. the Western Allies inevitably became junior partners of the USSR in the fight against the main enemy. Understanding this reality prompted Churchill to intensify diplomatic efforts to strengthen relations with Moscow. In January 1942, he sent Stalin a letter proposing the signing of an official treaty of alliance and mutual assistance. Negotiations on the treaty dragged on for several months. The main disagreements concerned the post-war structure of Eastern Europe. Stalin insisted that the Western Allies recognize the USSR's territorial acquisitions in 1939 to 1941, the annexation of the Baltic states, eastern Poland, and Bessarabia. Churchill had a dual position on this issue. On the one hand, he understood the strategic interests of the Soviet Union and was ready to recognize them. On the other hand, the British government was bound by obligations to the Polish government in exile and other allies. A compromise was found in the wording of the treaty. On May 26, 1942, the Anglo-Soviet Treaty of Alliance, Mutual Assistance, and Post-War Cooperation was signed in London. The treaty was valid for 20 years, which emphasized the long-term nature of the partnership. The signing of the treaty was an important political milestone. For the first time since the October Revolution, the USSR had entered into a full-fledged military-political alliance with a leading Western power. Ideological differences took a back seat in the face of a common threat. But the main test for the new alliance was to be the first personal meeting between Churchill and Stalin. And that meeting was just around the corner. On August 12, 1942, a plane with British markings landed at Moscow airport. A man in a tropical suit and helmet emerged from it, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Thus began the first personal meeting in history between the leaders of the Soviet Union and the British Empire. The trip to Moscow was a real challenge for Churchill. The 70-year-old politician traveled thousands of kilometers, flying via Gibraltar, Cairo, and Tehran. The route was not chosen by chance. A direct flight through Germany was impossible, and the northern route through the Arctic was too dangerous. The meeting at the airport was ceremonial, but not particularly warm. Molotov greeted the British guest with exaggerated politeness, but also with noticeable restraint. The Soviet side did not yet know what proposals Churchill had brought with him, and was preparing for difficult negotiations. The British delegation's accommodation at State Dhaka No. 7 in Sokolniki was the first sign of special attention being paid to the distinguished guest. The residence was furnished with Tsarist luxury, Persian carpets, crystal chandeliers, antique furniture. Stalin clearly wanted to impress the representative of the British aristocracy. The first meeting between Churchill and Stalin took place on the evening of August 12th in the Kremlin. The British Prime Minister was escorted to the Soviet leader's office, a small room with a long table, geographical maps on the walls, and portraits of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Stalin greeted his guest standing, but without a smile. Two men who had considered each other enemies for a quarter of a century were now face to face for the first time. Vladimir Pavlov served as interpreter and later published his memoirs about this historic meeting. The conversation began with an exchange of pleasantries, but very quickly moved on to the most painful topic, the question of the Second Front. Churchill immediately announced that a landing in northern France in 1942 was impossible. The Allies did not have sufficient forces for such an operation. Stalin's reaction was predictable. "The British are afraid of the Germans," he said, with poorly concealed irritation. The Soviet leader could not understand why the British, with their dominance at sea and significant air power, could not open a second front. Churchill patiently explained the difficulties of an amphibious operation. The Germans had managed to create powerful defensive lines along the entire Atlantic coast. The operation could end in a bloody failure, which would only strengthen Germany's position. It would be better to wait until 1943, when the Allies would be better prepared. The negotiations reached an impasse. Stalin openly expressed his dissatisfaction with the British position, while Churchill tried to justify himself by referring to objective difficulties. The atmosphere in the Kremlin office was heating up. It seemed that the first meeting of the Allies could end in complete failure. And then, Churchill played his trump card. He told Stalin about the plans for Operation Torch, the landing of Anglo-American troops in North Africa. According to eyewitnesses, the Soviet leader listened attentively to this message and asked many questions about the details of the upcoming operation. Gradually, the ice of mistrust began to melt. Stalin realized that the Allies really intended to open a second front, even if it was not where Moscow would have liked. North Africa was also a front against Germany and its allies. Every German soldier diverted from the Eastern Front eased the situation for the Red Army. By the end of the first day of negotiations, both sides had reached a mutual understanding. Churchill obtained Stalin's consent for the North African operation and a promise of understanding on the timing of the opening of a second front in Europe. Stalin secured an increase in Lend-Lease supplies and guarantees of British support. But the most important result of this meeting was the establishment of personal contact between the two leaders. They realized that they could find common ground, despite all their ideological differences and mutual grievances. The dispute over the Second Front became the central theme not only of the Moscow negotiations, but also of all subsequent relations between the Allies. For Stalin, it was a matter of life and death. Every day of delay meant thousands of additional casualties on the Eastern Front. The statistics were terrifying. By August 1942, the Red Army had lost more than 6 million people killed, wounded, and captured. German troops occupied territory that had been home to 70 million Soviet citizens before the war. The Wehrmacht was pushing towards the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Churchill understood the scale of Soviet losses, but had his own reasons for caution. The British armed forces had not yet recovered from the defeats of the early years of the war. The evacuation from Dunkirk, the fall of Singapore, and the failures in North Africa all undermined confidence in the British Army's ability to carry out a successful amphibious operation. During their second meeting in the Kremlin on August 14th, the atmosphere was even more tense. Stalin bluntly told Churchill, "You are afraid of the Germans. You should not be so afraid of them." Behind these words lay not only a reproach, but also a desire to hurt the British leader's pride. Churchill responded to this attack with dignity but firmness. He recalled how Britain had stood alone against Germany in 1940 to 1941, when the USSR was bound by a pact with Hitler. "We have proven that we are not afraid of the Germans," said the Prime Minister. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Churchill began to talk about plans for a bombing campaign against Germany. "If necessary, we will destroy almost every house in almost every German city," he said. These words clearly impressed Stalin. The Soviet leader listened attentively to the description of the power of the British bomber force. Thousands of aircraft struck German cities every night, destroying military factories, transport hubs, and residential areas. It was a second front in the air, already in full swing. Gradually, the tone of the conversation began to change. Stalin began to understand that the British were indeed waging an active war against Germany, albeit not on land. The air raids were causing serious damage to the German military industry and diverting significant air defense forces from the Eastern Front. Churchill's account of the planned operation in North Africa came as a surprise. Torch was to be the largest amphibious operation by the Western Allies since the beginning of the war. Landings in Morocco and Algeria would allow German and Italian forces in North Africa to be caught in a pincer movement and open the way for a further offensive. Stalin carefully studied the maps that Churchill had brought with him. Every German division transferred to Africa or left behind to defend it weakened the pressure on the Red Army. It was not the Second Front that Moscow had dreamed of, but it was still real help. By the end of the Moscow talks, both sides had reached a compromise. Churchill gained an understanding of the Soviet position on the timing of the opening of a second front in Europe. Stalin agreed that Operation Torch would make a significant contribution to the overall struggle against fascism. On August 17th, Churchill flew out of Moscow. The first personal meeting between the two leaders had come to an end. The results were mixed. Complete mutual understanding had not been achieved, but the ice of mistrust had begun to melt. Most importantly, the alliance had withstood its first serious test. The question of a second front remained on the agenda. It would arise again and again in correspondence between the leaders, at diplomatic conferences, and in public speeches. Every delay would be painfully perceived in Moscow, and every explanation from the British would be met with suspicion. But gradually the military situation was changing. The victories at Stalingrad and Kursk showed that the Red Army was capable not only of defending itself, but also of attacking. The Western Allies began to understand that the USSR would survive and become one of the world's leading powers after the war. This realization forced them to revise their strategic plans. On November 28, 1943, at 4 p.m., the most important conference of the war began at the Soviet embassy in Tehran. For the first time in the years of the war, the leaders of the three great powers, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, gathered together at one table. Choosing a venue for the conference was not easy. Churchill proposed Cairo, where inter-allied meetings had already been held. Roosevelt was inclined towards Baghdad or Istanbul, but Stalin, who was leaving the Soviet Union for the first time in 25 years, agreed only to Tehran, the capital of Iran, a friend of the USSR. Preparations for the meeting were conducted in the strictest secrecy. German intelligence was well informed about the upcoming conference and planned Operation Long Jump, an attempt to assassinate all three leaders at once. Only the brilliant work of Soviet intelligence, led by Gevorg Vartanyan, thwarted this audacious plan. Stalin arrived in Tehran on the 501st train from Moscow to Stalingrad to Baku. From the Azerbaijani capital, the Soviet delegation flew out on 2 planes accompanied by 27 fighter jets. Air Marshal Alexander Golovanov personally piloted one of the planes. Roosevelt and Churchill flew in from Egypt, where they had been holding talks with Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek and Turkish President İsmet İnönü shortly before the Tehran summit. The Western Allies sought to expand the anti-Hitler coalition and involve Turkey and China in active combat operations. The first meeting of the Big Three took place in a solemn atmosphere. "We have gathered here with one goal in mind: to win the war as quickly as possible," Roosevelt said as he opened the conference. Churchill emphasized the historical significance of the moment. "This is the greatest concentration of world power that has ever been in the history of mankind. Stalin was more reserved, but his words also sounded optimistic. History is smiling on us. It has given us great power and great opportunities. I hope that we will take all measures to ensure that this conference makes proper use of the power and authority entrusted to us by our peoples. The main issue on the agenda was the opening of a second front in Western Europe. By the end of 1943, the military situation had changed dramatically. The Red Army had won decisive victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, and German troops had gone on the defensive everywhere. Roosevelt strongly supported the Overlord Plan. The landing of Anglo-American troops in northern France in the spring of 1944. The American president understood that delaying the opening of a second front could lead to the USSR liberating all of Europe on its own. Churchill, without directly opposing Overlord, proposed an alternative: expanding operations in Italy and the Balkans. The British Prime Minister sought to secure the influence of the Western Allies in Central and Southeastern Europe and prevent the Soviet Union from gaining sole dominance there. Stalin strongly supported the American position. The best result will be achieved by striking the enemy in northern or northwestern France with a simultaneous landing in southern France, he said at one of the meetings. The Soviet leader understood perfectly well that the further west the Allies landed, the more German forces would be diverted from the Eastern Front. By the end of the second day, the negotiations had reached an impasse. Churchill stubbornly insisted on the Balkan option, while Roosevelt and Stalin demanded a landing in France. According to the recollections of the participants, the Soviet leader even said to Voroshilov, "Let's go. There's nothing more for us to do here." Roosevelt himself saved the situation by convincing Churchill to agree to the Overlord Plan during an EBT informal dinner. The British Prime Minister understood that without American support, Great Britain would not be able to realize its geopolitical ambitions in Europe. The third day of the Tehran talks was a turning point, not only in the question of the Second Front, but also in the formation of the post-war world order. Behind the closed doors of the Soviet embassy, the leaders of the three powers began to divide spheres of influence in the future Europe. Churchill, realizing the inevitability of the Overlord Agreement, tried to obtain compensation in other regions. On November 29th, he presented Stalin with a ceremonial sword, a gift from King George VI of Great Britain in commemoration of the heroic defense of Stalingrad. Behind this symbolic gesture lay an important political message. "Citizens of Stalingrad, strong as steel," read the inscription on the blade. A gift from King George VI in honor of the brave citizens of Stalingrad from the British people. Stalin accepted the sword and handed it to Voroshilov with the words, "Let the Marshal look at this sword." But behind the ceremonial gestures, a major political game was already in full swing. Churchill understood that if the USSR liberated Eastern Europe on its own, the Western Allies would lose all influence there. It was necessary to agree in advance on the division of zones of responsibility. The question of Poland became the first stumbling block. Stalin insisted that Poland's eastern border should follow the Curzon Line, a border proposed in 1920 by British Foreign Minister Lord Curzon. This meant that the USSR would retain the territories it had seized in 1939. Roosevelt and Churchill did not dare to openly oppose the Soviet demands. They understood that the Red Army was already at the borders of Poland, and no one could prevent Stalin from establishing a regime there that suited him. It was better to get some guarantees than to be left with nothing. In return, Stalin agreed to compensate Poland with German territories. The future Polish border was to run along the Oder and Neisse rivers, which meant the transfer of Silesia, East Prussia, and part of Pomerania to Warsaw. "Poland must receive adequate compensation in the West," said the Soviet leader. The question of Germany proved even more complicated. Roosevelt proposed dividing it into 5 autonomous states: Prussia, Hanover with the northwestern regions, Saxony with Leipzig, Hesse-Darmstadt with the areas south of the Rhine, and Bavaria with Baden-Württemberg. Churchill supported the idea of dismemberment, but proposed limiting it to 3 parts: separating Prussia, creating a South German Confederation, and forming an international zone in the Ruhr. "Prussia is the root of evil in Germany," the British Prime Minister asserted. Stalin took a more cautious position. He did not object to dismemberment in principle but warned, "It is wrong to use only dismemberment measures. Other measures must also be taken to prevent Germany from becoming aggressive again." Plans to create an international security organization were also discussed. Roosevelt put forward the concept of 4 policemen: the US, the USSR, Great Britain, and China, who were to maintain world order. Churchill was skeptical about including China in this group, proposing France instead. Stalin supported the American proposal, but with reservations. "China will be very weak after the war," he noted. "It is important to ensure the unity of action of the great powers." Behind these words lay the understanding that real power in the post-war world would belong to the 3 victorious powers. The issue of the war with Japan was discussed separately. Responding to the persistent requests of the Allies, Stalin declared the USSR's readiness to enter the war in the Pacific after Germany's surrender. This promise was of great importance to American strategy. By the end of the Tehran Conference, the contours of the post-war world were beginning to take shape. Europe was to be divided into spheres of influence. Germany was to be dismembered, or at least seriously weakened, and the world order was to be maintained by the joint efforts of the great powers. The alliance was necessarily turning into an instrument for redividing the world. A year and a quarter after the Tehran agreements, on February 4, 1945, Roosevelt's plane landed at Saki Airport on the Crimean Peninsula. The U.S. president arrived at the new meeting of the Big Three in Yalta, terminally ill. 2 months later, he would be gone. The choice of venue for the conference was symbolic. Crimea had only recently been liberated from German occupation, and traces of wartime destruction were still visible. Holding the negotiations in this location served to emphasize the decisive contribution of the USSR to the victory over fascism. Stalin welcomed his allies at the Levadia Palace, the former residence of Russian emperors. It was an irony of history that the revolutionary who had overthrown the Tsarist regime was now receiving the leaders of Western democracies in the chambers of Nicholas II. In a quarter of a century, the world had changed beyond recognition. By February 1945, the military situation was radically different from that in Tehran. The Red Army was 65 kilometers from Berlin, and Anglo-American troops were engaged in heavy fighting in the Rhine region. The end of the war was near, and now the main question was the post-war order of the world. The first meeting on February 4th showed how much the balance of power had changed. While in Tehran, Stalin had been the junior partner, forced to ask for help. Now he was dictating terms from a position of strength. The USSR had liberated Eastern Europe and could establish whatever order it wanted there. The Polish question once again became a stumbling block. By the start of the Yalta Conference, A pro-Soviet provisional government headed by Bolesław Bierut was already in place in Warsaw. The London government in exile, supported by the Western Allies, had effectively lost control of the country. Churchill desperately tried to defend the interests of his Polish allies. "For Britain, this is a matter of honor," he declared. "We entered the war because of Poland." But his arguments no longer had their former force. The Red Army controlled Polish territory, and it was impossible to change that. Roosevelt took a more flexible position. The American president understood that the USSR would not relinquish control over Poland, but that it was possible to try to obtain guarantees for the country's democratic development. "We must find a formula that will satisfy both the Poles and the Allies," he said. A compromise was found in the creation of a government of national unity, which was to include representatives of both the Warsaw and London governments. Stalin agreed to this, but with one caveat. The new cabinet would be based on Bierut's provisional government. The Far East issue was discussed in strict secrecy. Stalin confirmed the USSR's readiness to enter the war against Japan, but put forward specific conditions: the return of South Sakhalin, the transfer of the Kuril Islands, and the restoration of rights to the Chinese Eastern Railway and Port Arthur. Roosevelt agreed to these demands without consulting China. The American president was eager to bring the USSR into the war in the Pacific at any cost in order to avoid a bloody landing on the Japanese islands. He did not know that in 6 months' time, the atomic bomb would make Soviet participation in the war unnecessary. Discussions about the fate of Germany revealed deep divisions among the Allies. Everyone agreed on the need for occupation, but they had different views on its nature. Stalin insisted that Germany should pay for the destruction it had caused, with reparations amounting to $20 billion. Churchill categorically opposed such large reparations. "We do not want to turn Germany into a desert," he declared. The British Prime Minister remembered the lessons of the Treaty of Versailles. Excessive reparations could lead to a new war. Roosevelt tried to find a middle ground. He proposed the creation of a reparations commission to determine the exact amount of payments. But in principle, the American president did not object to the Soviet demands. The U.S. could afford to be generous, as its territory had not suffered from the war. The most important outcome of the Yalta Conference was the decision to create the United Nations. The charter of the new international organization was to be adopted at a conference in San Francisco. The USSR received 3 seats in the General Assembly. For itself, the Ukrainian SSR and the Belarusian SSR. On February 8th, the conference ended with the signing of a final communiqué. Outwardly, it all looked like a triumph of Allied unity. But behind the diplomatic wording lay the seeds of future conflicts. Each side understood the agreements in its own way. The last months of the war saw a rapid cooling of relations between the recent allies. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, the only one of the Big Three who sincerely believed in the possibility of post-war cooperation with the USSR, died. The new American president, Harry Truman, took a much tougher stance toward the Soviet Union. Just 11 days after taking office, he berated Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, accusing the USSR of violating the Yalta agreements on Poland. "You can only deal with the Russians from a position of strength," Truman told his advisors. These words heralded a new American policy. The era of alliance was ending, and an era of confrontation was beginning. Churchill watched with concern as the Red Army advanced rapidly through Central Europe. By early May, Soviet troops controlled territory from the Baltic to the Adriatic. "An iron curtain is descending across the continent," he wrote to Truman in a secret telegram. The question of the fate of the liberated territories became increasingly acute. In Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, the Soviet command actively promoted the rise to power of communist parties. The Western Allies protested, but could not change anything. Their troops were far from these countries. The question of Yugoslavia was particularly painful for Churchill. The British Prime Minister had hoped that the country would remain in the Western sphere of influence. But Marshal Josip Broz Tito, relying on Soviet support, pursued an independent policy. The Balkans were slipping out of British control. On May 1st, units of the Red Army and the U.S. Army met on the Elbe. Soviet and American soldiers embraced, exchanged gifts, and swore eternal friendship. But their commanders already looked at each other with suspicion, preparing for a new confrontation. On May 8th, in the Berlin suburb of Karlshorst, the Act of Unconditional Surrender of Germany was signed. The war in Europe ended with a complete victory for the anti-Hitler coalition. But this victory also marked the end of the alliance of necessity. Churchill increasingly demanded that Truman take a tough stance toward the USSR. "We must settle all contentious issues with the Russians before our armies are demobilized," he telegraphed the American president. The British leader understood that time was working against the West. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was preparing to fulfill its Yalta promise to wage war against Japan. Stalin was transferring enormous forces to the Far East. More than 1 million men, thousands of tanks and aircraft. This operation was to be the last act of Allied solidarity. But on August 6th, the first atomic bomb exploded over Hiroshima. On August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. On the same day, the USSR entered the war against Japan, as promised. But atomic weapons radically changed the strategic situation. The Americans no longer needed the help of the Red Army to defeat Japan. Moreover, Soviet intervention became undesirable, as it allowed the USSR to establish itself in the Far East. But it was already impossible to stop the war machine that had been set in motion by the Allies' agreement. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. World War II was over, but the peace that was supposed to reign after the victory over fascism turned out to be illusory. The alliance of necessity was replaced by a new global confrontation. The personal relationship between Churchill and Stalin grew increasingly frosty during these months. The warm wartime letters were replaced by dry diplomatic notes. Each side accused the other of violating its alliance obligations. The trust that had been so painstakingly established was crumbling before their eyes. The last meeting of the wartime leaders was to take place in Potsdam. But these would no longer be negotiations between allies, but between rivals sharing the fruits of victory and preparing for a new confrontation. On July 17, 1945, in the suburbs of defeated Berlin, in Potsdam, the last conference of the Big Three opened. But this was no longer the Troika that had met in Tehran and Yalta. Roosevelt was replaced by Truman, and in the midst of the conference, Churchill was replaced by Labour's Clement Attlee, who had won the parliamentary elections. Only Stalin remained a constant participant in all three meetings. The Soviet leader watched the change of Western partners with irony. "Democracy is an interesting thing," he remarked to one of his aides. Behind these words lay an understanding of the advantages of an authoritarian system in international affairs. The Potsdam Conference took place in a completely different atmosphere than the previous meetings. The common enemy had been defeated, and the need for an alliance had disappeared. Now, the former partners were openly competing for influence in the post-war world. The spirit of cooperation had been replaced by a spirit of competition. The German question became the main stumbling block. The USSR insisted on reparations of $10 billion, half of which was to come from the Western occupation zones. The Americans and British categorically rejected this demand. "We will not pay for the reconstruction of Russia at the expense of German industry," Truman declared. The new American president was much more straightforward than the diplomatic Roosevelt. He did not shy away from showing his dissatisfaction with Soviet demands. Churchill, despite his defeat in the elections, continued to participate in the first half of the conference. The British leader tried to consolidate the Western position against the USSR. "Stalin wants the fruits of war and the endless expansion of his power and doctrines," he told Truman in a private conversation. The Polish question once again became a source of sharp disagreement. By July 1945, Beruta's pro-Soviet government was in complete control of the country. The expansion of the government promised at Yalta amounted to the inclusion of a few minor figures from the London camp. The Western Allies protested, but their protests sounded increasingly helpless. "The reality is that Berut's government controls Poland," Stalin coolly stated. Behind these words lay a simple truth. Whoever controls the territory dictates the rules. The question of Poland's western border also caused serious controversy. The USSR had already transferred German territories up to the Oder-Neisse line to Polish administration. Truman and Churchill considered this a premature decision that prejudged the peace negotiations. The Germans themselves fled from the advancing troops, Stalin justified himself. Indeed, millions of German refugees left the eastern regions, fearing revenge for the crimes of the Nazis. But Western leaders understood that this was not a matter of temporary measures, but of irreversible territorial changes. On July 25th, an event occurred that permanently changed the dynamics of the negotiations. Truman informed Stalin of the successful testing of a new weapon of exceptional destructive power. The American president closely watched the Soviet leader's reaction. Stalin listened to the message calmly and merely wished the Americans good luck in using this weapon against the Japanese. He showed neither surprise nor concern. Truman did not know that Soviet intelligence had long since informed the Kremlin about the Manhattan Project. In fact, the news of the atomic bomb made a deep impression on Stalin. That same evening, he urgently contacted Moscow and ordered the acceleration of work on the Soviet atomic project under the leadership of Igor Kurchatov. The U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons radically changed the global balance of power. On August 2nd, the conference ended with the signing of a final communiqué. Formally, the Allies agreed on the principles of governing occupied Germany, reparations, and new borders in Europe. But behind the diplomatic wording lay deep disagreements. The Potsdam Conference was the swan song of the anti-Hitler coalition. The alliance ended with the war out of necessity. Now the former partners were preparing for a new confrontation, which would soon be called the Cold War. Saying goodbye to Attlee and Truman, Stalin, according to eyewitness accounts, said, "Goodbye. We'll see when we meet again." He did not know that this meeting would be the last. The leaders of the USSR, the US, and the UK would never again gather at the same table. Just a few weeks after the end of the Potsdam Conference, a plan with the ominous code name Unthinkable began to be developed in the secret offices of London. Churchill, despite his defeat in the elections, continued to influence British foreign policy and insisted on preparing for war with his recent ally. Russia poses a mortal threat to the free world, the former Prime Minister wrote in a secret memo to the new government. After 4 years of alliance, he was still unable to shake his deep distrust of the Soviet system. The temporary partnership was over, and old phobias returned with a vengeance. The unthinkable plan called for a preemptive war against the USSR using the remnants of the German army. British strategists hoped that the Western Allies would be able to strike before the Soviet demobilization was complete. The timing seemed favorable. The Red Army was exhausted by the war, and the United States had a monopoly on atomic weapons. The details of the plan were strikingly cynical. It was planned to use German prisoners of war, and even parts of the Wehrmacht that had not yet been disbanded. Yesterday's enemies were to become allies in the war against yesterday's partners. History was preparing an incredible twist. On July 1st, 1945, the British Joint Planning Committee presented a report on the possibilities of military action against the USSR. The conclusion was disappointing for supporters of a preventive war. The chances of a quick victory are doubtful. Russia is capable of prolonged resistance. Military experts soberly assess the balance of power. In the west of the USSR, the Red Army had about 174 divisions against 14 British and American divisions. Even taking into account the qualitative superiority of Western technology, the chances of success seemed slim. Truman treated the British plans with caution. The American president understood that a war with the USSR would lead to enormous casualties and could end in defeat. Public opinion in the U.S. demanded demobilization and a return to peaceful life, not a new bloody war. Meanwhile, Stalin was receiving information about Western plans through his intelligence network. Agents in London and Washington reported on the preparations for Operation Unthinkable. The Soviet leader did not panic, but took the necessary precautions. "They won't dare," Stalin told his associates, analyzing the British plans. He correctly assessed the political situation in the West. The victorious nations were tired of war and would not support a new aggression. But just in case, Soviet demobilization was slowed down. By the fall of 1945, the unthinkable plan was effectively buried. The British command came to the conclusion that war with the USSR was impossible without a full-scale mobilization of the Western Allies. And such a mobilization was politically unfeasible. But the very fact that this plan was developed showed how quickly the Allies had become potential adversaries. The ashes of Berlin had not yet cooled, and former partners were already planning a new war. The logic of confrontation between the great powers proved stronger than the memory of their joint struggle. Churchill did not give up his attempts to mobilize Western public opinion against the USSR. On March 5, 1946, in the American city of Fulton, he delivered his famous speech about the Iron Curtain. From Szczecin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, across the continent, an Iron Curtain has descended, he said. This speech became the manifesto of the Cold War. Churchill openly called for the creation of an Anglo-American alliance against the USSR. "I do not believe that Soviet Russia wants war. What it wants is the fruits of war and the unlimited spread of its power and doctrines," he said to the applause of the American audience. Stalin's reaction to Fulton's speech was harsh and unequivocal. "Mr. Churchill and his friends are strikingly reminiscent of Hitler and his friends," he said, in an interview with Pravda. The comparison with the Nazis was the strongest insult to a man who had fought against fascism. Thus ended the story of the alliance of necessity. Churchill and Stalin, who had fought side by side against a common enemy for 4 years, became symbols of a new confrontation. Their personal rivalry turned into a global confrontation between two systems. The unthinkable plan remained on paper, but its spirit was embodied in the policy of containment, the creation of NATO, and the arms race. The Cold War became a logical continuation of the alliance of necessity. Only now the former partners were opposed to each other. Decades after the end of World War II, historians continue to debate the legacy of the alliance between Stalin and Churchill. Was it a sincere partnership or a cynical marriage of convenience? Could former enemies become true friends? Or was their rapprochement doomed to failure from the outset? Objectively assessing the results of the two leaders' cooperation, one cannot help but acknowledge its tremendous effectiveness. The anti-Hitler coalition defeated the most powerful military machine in human history in record time. What the Entente failed to achieve in 4 years of World War I, the Allies accomplished in 6 years of World War II. The personal contribution of Churchill and Stalin to this victory cannot be overestimated. The British Prime Minister managed to overcome centuries-old prejudices and extend a helping hand to the communist regime. The Soviet leader rejected ideological dogmas and accepted the support of the imperialist powers. Both leaders put national interests above class and party interests. Their wartime correspondence is a unique document of the era. More than 200 letters and telegrams show how trust gradually developed between people who had considered each other enemies for a quarter of a century. Stalin and Churchill learned to speak the same language, the language of pragmatic politics. But the alliance initially contained the seeds of future conflict. Their value systems were too different. Their ideas about the post-war world too opposed. Churchill dreamed of restoring the balance of power in Europe, while Stalin dreamed of creating a belt of friendly regimes along the Soviet borders. Geography played a fateful role in the fate of the alliance. The Red Army liberated Eastern Europe and inevitably established Soviet control there. The Western Allies landed in France and Italy, extending their influence to these regions. Every mile covered by the Allied troops increased their post-war ambitions. The tragedy was that both leaders sincerely tried to maintain cooperation after the war. Stalin repeatedly emphasized that the USSR did not claim world domination and was ready for peaceful competition between systems. Churchill, despite all his anti-Soviet rhetoric, understood the value of the Soviet market for the British economy. But the logic of confrontation between the great powers proved stronger than personal sympathies and rational considerations. The power vacuum created after the collapse of Germany and Japan inevitably had to be filled. The USSR and its Western allies simply could not avoid clashing in the struggle for influence over the liberated territories. The atomic bomb was the final nail in the coffin of the alliance. The American monopoly on nuclear weapons radically changed the global balance of power. The USSR went from being an equal partner to a potential victim of nuclear blackmail. Stalin could not allow this and began the accelerated development of his own nuclear weapons. The personal relationship between Churchill and Stalin reflected the general dynamics of international relations, from mutual hostility to forced partnership, from partnership to rivalry, from rivalry to open confrontation. This path was followed not only by the two leaders, but also by the countries they led. The paradox is that the Cold War, which began immediately after the end of the Hot War, paradoxically prevented a Third World War. The presence of nuclear weapons on both sides made direct confrontation too dangerous. The former allies learned to oppose each other without resorting to open conflict. The legacy of the alliance between Stalin and Churchill lives on today. Their experience shows that even the most irreconcilable enemies can find common ground in the face of a common threat. But it also demonstrates the fragility of such alliances and the inevitability of their collapse when the unifying danger disappears. The history of this alliance is a story of how politics triumphs over ideology, how national interests prove more important than class prejudices, and how personal relationships between leaders can change the course of world events. It is a lesson for all future generations of politicians and diplomats. The alliance between Stalin and Churchill was truly an alliance of necessity, but it was precisely this necessity that saved the world from fascist enslavement and laid the foundations for the modern world order. This is its main historical significance.